We are witnessing what may well be the most consequential week in international relations since the end of the Cold War. Four simultaneous crises are unfolding across the globe, each interconnected in ways that reveal a fundamental shift in the global order. What we're seeing is not merely a series of isolated incidents, but rather the manifestation of a deeper structural collapse in the post-1991 international system. The convergence of these events suggests we have reached what historians may later identify as a definitive inflection point in modern geopolitics. Let me begin with what I consider to be the most significant development, though it has received remarkably little attention in Western media. Moscow has formally demanded the prosecution of Ukrainian leadership for what it terms war crimes, while simultaneously accusing Kiev of systematically obstructing prisoner exchanges. This is not mere rhetoric. When we examine the details provided by Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova, we see something far more substantial. According to official Russian statements, approximately 700 Ukrainian prisoners were offered for exchange, but Kiev has shown no interest in their return. More troubling still, Zakharova claims that Ukrainian authorities are actively refusing to take back these individuals, some of whom have been classified by their own government as traitors. This presents us with a remarkable situation, a government that appears to be abandoning its own citizens while simultaneously demanding the inclusion of nationalist fighters and foreign mercenaries in exchange lists. The pattern suggests a deliberate strategy to prioritize ideological allies over ordinary soldiers. But the implications extend far beyond prisoner exchanges. What we're witnessing is Moscow's systematic preparation for a post-conflict legal reckoning. The Russians are building comprehensive cases against Ukrainian leadership, documenting what they claim are systematic violations of international law. This is not the behavior of a country preparing for negotiated settlement. This is the behavior of a country preparing for complete victory. Now let me turn to what may be an even more extraordinary development. We have learned that senior Ukrainian officials, led by Rustem Umerov, have been conducting intensive negotiations with American representatives in Florida. These talks involved Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy, alongside Jared Kushner and Secretary of State Marco Rubio. What emerges from these discussions is deeply troubling for anyone who understands the dynamics of international negotiations. Multiple sources now confirm that Witkoff has been working directly with Kirill Dmitriev, a senior Russian economic negotiator, to shape what is being called a peace plan. But when we examine the details of this plan, what we find is something that looks remarkably similar to Moscow's maximum demands. Ukraine would be required to cede territory, dramatically reduce its military capabilities, and accept severe restrictions on its future alliances. What makes this particularly significant is the revelation that Witkoff, a real estate developer with no diplomatic experience, has apparently sidelined pro-Ukraine voices within the Trump administration. Keith Kellogg, Trump's special envoy for Ukraine and one of Kiev's few remaining advocates in Washington, is reportedly stepping down in January. This leaves Ukraine without any significant champion in the White House, just as these critical negotiations are taking place. Sources familiar with the internal dynamics describe a systematic campaign to marginalize traditional foreign policy establishments in favor of Trump's personal business associates. The pattern here is unmistakable. The Trump administration is not merely seeking to end the conflict in Ukraine, it is actively facilitating terms that would represent a comprehensive Russian victory. When we consider that Witkoff has been described as running a shadow operation to marginalize Ukraine supporters, we begin to understand the true nature of what is transpiring. But perhaps the most telling development occurred during the recent meeting between Witkoff and Vladimir Putin in Moscow. This was not a brief courtesy call. According to Kremlin sources, the meeting lasted approximately 5 hours. When envoys from major powers spend 5 hours in direct discussion, we are not talking about preliminary exchanges of views. We are talking about detailed negotiations over specific terms. Putin himself provided crucial insights into these discussions. He confirmed that the American proposals were based on agreements reached during his August meeting with Trump in Alaska. This is extraordinary. It suggests that a comprehensive framework for Ukrainian capitulation was agreed upon months ago, and what we are witnessing now is simply the implementation of those agreements. The Russian president also revealed that the Americans have broken their 28-point plan into 4 separate packages. This is classic negotiation tactics, breaking down complex agreements into manageable components to make them easier to accept. But it also suggests a level of sophistication in these negotiations that goes far beyond what is being publicly acknowledged. Now I must address what I consider to be perhaps the most ominous aspect of current developments. While these diplomatic maneuvers have been unfolding, the military situation on the ground has deteriorated catastrophically for Ukraine. Russian forces have captured the strategically important village of Grishino, which brings them within striking distance of critical Ukrainian supply lines. Grishino may seem like a small place, but its capture represents something much larger. This village sits astride key transportation routes that Ukrainian forces have relied upon to maintain their positions in the broader Pokrovsk area. With Grishino now under Russian control, we are looking at the potential collapse of an entire sector of Ukrainian defenses. What makes this particularly significant is the speed with which it occurred. According to Russian Ministry of Defense reports, their forces engaged multiple Ukrainian brigades in the area and inflicted severe casualties. The latest figures suggest that Ukrainian forces lost up to 490 personnel in a single day of fighting around Grishino and adjacent areas. These are not the casualties of a force conducting an organized withdrawal. These are the casualties of a force in disarray. Independent military analysts have noted the absence of effective Ukrainian counterattacks, suggesting that reserve formations either no longer exist in sufficient strength or are being held back for the defense of more critical positions. The broader military picture is equally grim for Ukraine. Russian forces are simultaneously advancing on multiple fronts. In the Kharkiv direction, they have intensified operations near Kupiansk. In the Zaporizhzhia region, they are pressing toward critical transportation hubs. This is not the pattern of localized tactical successes. This is the pattern of systematic operational breakthrough. But what truly concerns me is what these military developments reveal about the state of Ukrainian resistance. When we examine the details provided by Russian sources, we see repeated references to Ukrainian units abandoning positions, suffering heavy equipment losses, and failing to maintain coherent defensive lines. This suggests that Ukrainian military capabilities have degraded far more severely than Western governments have been willing to acknowledge. The timing of these military setbacks, coinciding with the intensive diplomatic negotiations I described earlier, cannot be coincidental. Putin has repeatedly demonstrated that he coordinates military operations with diplomatic initiatives. The pressure being applied on Ukrainian forces serves to reinforce the message being delivered through diplomatic channels. Resistance is futile and capitulation is inevitable. This brings me to what may be the most significant aspect of current developments that very few people are discussing. While attention has focused on Ukraine, the United States has been conducting what amounts to a dress rehearsal for military intervention in Venezuela. The scale of American military deployments to the Caribbean is extraordinary and has received insufficient analysis. The USS Gerald R. Ford, America's most advanced aircraft carrier, is now stationed within striking distance of Venezuela. This is accompanied by multiple destroyers, amphibious assault ships, and support vessels. Conservative estimates suggest that approximately 15,000 American military personnel are now deployed in the Caribbean theater. This represents the largest American military presence in Latin America since the Cold War. The logistical complexity of maintaining such a force projection demonstrates a level of commitment that far exceeds typical counter-narcotics operations, suggesting longer-term strategic objectives. Officially, this deployment is characterized as a counter-narcotics operation. American forces have conducted multiple airstrikes against alleged drug smuggling vessels, resulting in at least 83 confirmed deaths. But when we examine the broader strategic context, it becomes clear that narcotics interdiction is merely the pretext for something much larger. The Trump administration has now designated the Cartel de los Soles as a foreign terrorist organization. This is the group that Washington alleges is led by Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. This designation dramatically expands the legal authorities available to American forces and provides justification for direct military action against Venezuelan government targets. What we are witnessing is the systematic preparation for regime change operation. The military assets being deployed are far in excess of what would be required for narcotics interdiction. The USS Gerald Ford is not an anti-drug platform. It is a power projection platform designed to impose American will through overwhelming military superiority. The connection between these apparently separate crises becomes clear when we consider them from Moscow's perspective. Russia is simultaneously consolidating its victory in Ukraine, watching America's principal European allies exhaust themselves financially and militarily, and observing Washington commit substantial military resources to yet another intervention in Latin America. From the Kremlin standpoint, this represents a strategic windfall. Every American asset deployed to the Caribbean is an asset not available for operations in Eastern Europe or the Western Pacific. Every dollar spent on Venezuelan intervention is a dollar not available for Ukrainian support. Every week that American attention focuses on Latin America is a week in which Russian forces can continue their systematic dismantlement of Ukrainian resistance. But there is a deeper strategic dimension that I believe most analysts are missing. What we are witnessing is not simply the resolution of individual crises, but rather the emergence of a new international system. The post-Cold War order, dominated by American hegemony and liberal institutional frameworks, is giving way to something fundamentally different. Russia has demonstrated that it can successfully challenge American power in what Washington has long considered its own sphere of influence. China has shown that it can outmaneuver American trade policy and maintain strategic partnerships despite enormous pressure. Meanwhile, America finds itself simultaneously engaged in multiple conflicts without the resources or strategic coherence to achieve decisive outcomes in any of them. The implications of this transformation extend far beyond immediate military or diplomatic outcomes. We are watching the emergence of a multipolar world in which American power, while still substantial, is no longer sufficient to impose its will unilaterally. This represents the most significant shift in global power relations since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Consider the economic dimensions of current developments. The European Union remains unable to resolve the question of frozen Russian assets, with Belgium, France, and Italy all expressing serious reservations about proposed confiscation schemes. Meanwhile, China continues to expand its economic ties, with Russia providing Moscow with alternative markets and supply chains that reduce the impact of Western sanctions. The energy sector provides perhaps the clearest illustration of this shift. Despite enormous efforts to curtail Russian hydrocarbon exports, Moscow has successfully redirected its sales to Asian markets. India has become a major purchaser of Russian oil, while China has dramatically expanded its energy cooperation with Moscow. The result is that Russia's energy revenues have proved far more resilient than Western policymakers anticipated. Recent data suggests that Russian oil exports to Asia now exceed pre-conflict levels, while new pipeline infrastructure and alternative payment systems have made sanctions increasingly ineffective. This economic dimension reinforces the military and diplomatic trends I have described. Russia possesses the financial resources to sustain its military operations indefinitely, while Ukraine becomes increasingly dependent on Western support that is both politically controversial and economically unsustainable. The broader implications become clear when we consider the trajectory of current developments. The negotiated settlement taking shape between Washington and Moscow effectively represents Ukrainian capitulation disguised as diplomatic compromise. The American military deployment in the Caribbean suggests that Washington is seeking to compensate for its Ukrainian failure by demonstrating strength in Latin America. Meanwhile, the systematic degradation of Ukrainian military capabilities indicates that battlefield outcomes will soon make diplomatic negotiations irrelevant. What we are witnessing, in essence, is the resolution of multiple crises in ways that reinforce a fundamental shift away from American hegemony toward a more complex, multipolar system. Russia emerges victorious in Eastern Europe. China maintains its strategic partnerships and economic growth, while America finds itself increasingly isolated and overstretched. The human costs of these developments are enormous and should not be overlooked. Ukrainian military casualties continue to mount, while civilian populations suffer the consequences of prolonged conflict. Venezuelan civilians face the prospect of yet another foreign intervention, with all the instability and suffering such operations inevitably bring. But from a purely analytical perspective, what we are observing represents the most significant transformation of the international system in more than 3 decades. The rules, institutions, and power relationships that have defined global politics since 1991 are being systematically dismantled and replaced. The question that emerges from this analysis is not whether this transformation will continue. The momentum appears irreversible, but rather how quickly it will be completed and what the final configuration of global power will look like. Current trends suggest that we are moving toward a world in which American influence, while still significant, will be balanced by major Eurasian powers operating within spheres of influence that Washington will be unable to penetrate or control. This represents a return to something resembling the great power politics of earlier eras, but with the added complexity of economic interdependence, technological connectivity, and nuclear weapons. The stability of such a system will depend on the ability of major powers to establish clear spheres of influence while avoiding direct military confrontation. The developments I've described today suggest that we are well advanced in this process of transformation. The question is no longer whether the post-Cold War order will survive, but rather what will replace it and how successfully the transition can be managed. Current evidence suggests that this transition is proceeding largely on terms favorable to America's strategic competitors, while Washington struggles to adapt to rapidly changing realities. What emerges from this analysis is a sobering assessment of American strategic position, simultaneously engaged in multiple conflicts, lacking the resources for decisive action in any theatre, and facing competitors who have successfully adapted to changing circumstances. The United States appears to be experiencing what can only be described as strategic. The pattern mirrors historical precedents of imperial decline, where global commitments exceed available resources and strategic competitors exploit resulting vulnerabilities. This dynamic appears to be accelerating rather than stabilizing, suggesting that current trends will intensify rather than moderate in the coming months. The implications extend far beyond immediate crisis management to fundamental questions about America's role in the world and its ability to maintain the global influence it has exercised for the past 3 decades. We are witnessing not merely the resolution of individual conflicts, but the emergence of an entirely new international system.